watching Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya. A new report shows big spending on the military in 2022. Despite soaring inflation and the cost of living crisis, military expenditure reached Cold War levels in Central and Western Europe. In our next story, Pulitzer-winning journalist Seymour Hersh talks to RT about the explosions in the Nord Stream pipelines last year after his exposé that said it was not a Russian affair. He told the Russian TV channel US President Joe Biden wanted to stop Germany from changing its mind about sanctions against Russia. And finally, wrestlers in India have moved the Supreme Court against the chief of the Wrestling Federation, who they charge with sexual harassment. The largest increase in military expenditure ever by any country has been recorded by SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Ukraine's military spending grew by 640% in 2022. Its military expenses are now 34% of its GDP. To get an idea of the scale of the increase, it was just 3.2% of the GDP in 2021. But the United States still spends more than any other country on the military, $877 billion, 3 times what China, ranked second by SIPRI, spent in 2022. The more than $19 billion the United States gave Ukraine to fight Russia is also the biggest military aid ever. We go to Abdul from People's Dispatch, who has been looking at the details SIPRI has released so far. Abdul, good to have you here. Abdul, it would seem that the presence or the involvement of the United States, wherever in the world it might be, it's pushing up the military expenditure of the regions involved. Is that the picture we get from the SIPRI report?
Of course, that is a obvious conclusion, because if you see, US defense expenditure is primarily because of its global empire. The hundreds of bases it maintains all across the world. Maintaining army, maintaining the navy is the primary mover behind this almost $1 trillion defense budget which US has. Of course, a very small part of it also is related to the Ukraine war, which around $20 billion, going to last year at least Ukraine. But I think that is a very small amount, irrespective of whether there is an Ukraine war or not. US defense expenditures have been rising for last many years, and even if there are no major wars, that it seems to be rising for various reasons. And the primary reason behind it, as you rightly pointed out, is the global empire which US has. For example, if you see, there is a US Central Command, there is US African Command, there is a command in Europe, there is similar commands for Pacific and other seas. So in the South China Sea, it is maneuvering every day. There is some or other maneuvering happening to provoke China or to kind of corner China in that particular region. It basically tries to encircle whichever country it declares to be its enemy in the West Asian region. If you see, there are bases all around Iran. There are bases around other countries which are for example, in Black Sea region, which is considered to be Russia's quote-unquote backyard. The US has a military presence. Last few months, we have seen how US drones were shot down by Russians and all. So if you see, because of its global engagement, whether it is directly maintaining the bases or quote-unquote aiding its allies in their different defense programs, basically pushes the American taxpayers to pay more, and that basically ultimately the American people have to pay to maintain their own the empire which US has built for last at least since the Second World War.
Right, Abdul. And Abdul, there's also, the report says that, well, this kind of expenditure, we're not going to see it slowing down. So coming back to Europe, which are the countries which are spending a lot? Do we know why?
Well, Europe is a crucial case. As per the SIPRI report, it has spent more money last year
Right.
than since 1989. That
Right.
was, we should know that that was the period when the Cold War was ending and there was quote unquote hypertension in the region because, of course, the imperialist war which US has waged vis-a-vis the Warsaw Pact countries. NATO was being basically aggressively pursuing the policy of capitalism, liberalization, and so on and so forth. So that in 1989 there was a kind of the amount of defense expenditure, we see the similar defense expenditure. If you see post 1990s, there was a gradual decline. There was a period of gradual decline in defense expenditure in many European countries. Now that trend has has been reversed, and there is increasing defense expenditure. It will increase further in the coming days, coming years, primarily because of the two reasons. Of course, one is the US emphasis that all the NATO countries need to share the burden of common defense.
Right.
They have to increase their defense expenditure. So the countries like Finland, which joined the NATO earlier this month, will have to increase its defense expenditure, and that is reflected,
Right.
already reflected. It has increased its defense expenditure by almost 27%, or more than 27% in comparison to 2021. Then, of course, there is the war which is going on in Ukraine. So that becomes a kind of an excuse for various ruling classes in European countries, which basically have surrendered their foreign policies to the diktats of the US. So whatever US demands, they will have to do, whether it is in their interest or not. For example, the cost of living crisis,
Right.
which most of the European countries are facing. The common people are unable to meet their expenses because of the rising prices, and those prices are rising primarily because the European countries have followed the US diktats and sanctioned the Russian energy imports, Russian grain imports, Russian fertilizer imports, and so on and so forth. So all of these have led to the increase in the prices. So of course the European ruling classes know that their policies of following the diktats of the US has been primarily responsible for the suffering of the masses. Instead of addressing that and cutting down their dependence on US and adopting an independent policy vis-a-vis Russia or vis-a-vis any part of the world, they are basically following those diktats, which ultimately will reflect into the cutting of the social expenditure and increase in the defense and military expenditure. So people have to suffer because the ruling classes do not think that it is worthwhile to assert their independence vis-a-vis US, and that basically is the reason behind Europeans what we see in SIPRI, the rise in their defense expenditure.
And also, like, they claim that this is not likely to end very soon.
Of course, some countries have adopted 10-year plans
Right.
of gradually increasing their defense expenditure.
Thanks, Abdul, for joining us with that update. Even before the hostilities in Ukraine, US President Joe Biden had reportedly hatched a plan to bomb the Nord Stream pipelines. The actual explosions occurred in September 2022, apparently to help Ukraine, which was then on the back foot in its conflict with Russia. Seymour Hersh has followed up his story released on Substack a couple of months ago with an interview with RT, explaining the silence of Germany on the entire affair. Remember that the pipelines were vital in strengthening energy ties between Germany and Russia. We'll go back to Abdul for more details. So, Abdul, when that report was filed by Seymour Hersh, everybody said, well, Germany's silence is mysterious. Why was that? Can you just give us some context to that surprise about Germany's silence?
Well, we already talked about how most of the European countries have surrendered their foreign policy to the US diktats.
Right.
So if US is involved in damaging the Nord Stream pipelines, which is very crucial, particularly for Germany's economy, and Germany, despite knowing through different revelations, hers was the latest. If you
Right.
see, there were many other indications which basically hinted that it is primarily the US which is responsible for what happened to the Nord Stream gas pipelines. German ruling classes, despite knowing that US has been responsible for the attack, which basically hampers their economic interest, did not do anything.
Right.
Primarily because they do not seem to have the courage to stand up against the US diktats vis-a-vis the entire geopolitical untangling or unfolding events which are happening in the Eastern Europe, including the war in Ukraine. The second thing, of course, this is not for the first time that the German government has basically refused to take a stand which reflects that they are also pursuing their national interest. If we recall, few months, years back, there was revelation that how US has been constantly interfering in the decision-making process in Germany,
Right.
in the German politics. But the then government of Germany did not do anything about it. Then the US has forced Germany to basically increase their defense expenditure because Germany being a NATO member, despite it was the primary country which basically forced Germans to dismantle their army post the Second World War. In last few years, US has forced Germany to increase their defense expenditure, but German ruling classes have refused to stand up against it and say that no, we will not do it because that basically hampers the German people.
Right.
But all these things primarily happening because it's a growing dominance, at least in terms of vis-a-vis relation between Europe and US, dominance of the European capital, and there seems to be a kind of lack of courage that in the absence of any other word, we can use that lack of courage because nothing else explains it. That the German government has refused to challenge it.
Okay.
And that basically explains why Germany has not done it. Of course, the internal politics, their attempt to basically be relevant in the larger global empire, of course, is also contributing into this, but primarily it is basically a lack of courage. There is no other word for that.
So coming back to Seymour Hersh, so what you're saying is that the United States has actually blown up the Nord Streams according to Seymour Hersh's report and his interview. But if Russia is blamed for it, then Germany will not have any reason to back away from the sanctions that the United States wants it to impose on Russia. Is that the picture?
Of course, that is quite obvious. If the primary motive, as Hersh claims, behind blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline was to basically take Germany away from their dependence on Russian energy. If once that is taken away, the Germans there can be ordered or there can be dictates to them to follow a particular policy, and that basically becomes easy. That was the primary reasoning behind this particular operation. That is one thing which is quite obvious. Apart from, see, in Hersh's interview, if you see, there are references to corruption in US,
Right.
corruption in Ukraine, and how the war basically is seen as an opportunity by the ruling classes in both Ukraine and in US to basically make more money. He says it very clearly. And then there are references of how the weapons supplied by different NATO countries, including the US, billions of dollars of weapon to Ukraine to quote-unquote fight against Russians,
Right.
basically are smuggled out from Ukraine to other neighboring countries. That also Hersh's latest piece on this.
Yes.
The most important part which Hersh mentions in his recent interview with the RT, he talks about how in last few years at least, the US media which claim to be independent, has basically completely become subservient to the ruling classes, and particular the Biden administration. He referred to
Biden, yes.
New York Times self-praising about exposing a source which basically led to the leak, the whistleblower, which basically was responsible for the leak of the US defense documents recently. So how New York Times basically seeks kind of praise from the larger masses, the readers, and the US government for doing that, which basically is a violation of the US, of course, constitutional provisions for freedom of press and so on and so forth. Apart from that, it also violates the basic ethics in media, where you don't reveal your sources. So Hersh, apart from talking about how Nord Stream pipeline, which basically was his earlier article, he also talks about his latest revelations and latest articles, which are published on his blog, and all of them people should read to basically to understand what is going on in reality, instead of following the mainstream media, which basically is parroting what the government is feeding to them.
Right, and it also explains why Seymour Hersh, being a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, doesn't get space in any channel.
In the mainstream media, quote-unquote mainstream media, yeah.
Okay, Abdul, thanks a lot for joining us. After 3 months of not being heard, a group of top Indian female wrestlers have moved the Supreme Court. They wanted to pursue charges of sexual harassment that they have leveled since early this year against the Wrestling Federation of India chief Brij Bhushan Sharan Singh. The women, many have won medals in national and international competitions, are supported by male wrestlers and other male and female athletes. They had suspended their protest 3 months ago, saying the government has promised to investigate the matter. Sports journalist Siddhant Ane joins us over video conference with more details. Okay, Siddhant, thanks for joining us. Look, Siddhant, some pretty emotional scenes over the weekend. The women wrestlers were weeping on the channels. They said they aren't being listened. And, can you just tell us what the complaints are? And also, the man they're charging of sexual harassment, what do we know about him?
I can try to, for sure, Pragya. So this is not a new story, like you were saying. A group of wrestlers, world champions, Olympic medalists, etc., among them, came out a while ago with these allegations and are now saying that as many as 7 women wrestlers have submitted formal complaints against Brij Bhushan Sharan Singh, who is the head of the Wrestling Federation of India. He is a long-time politician. He's been a parliamentarian since the early 90s, in fact, and so is very well established in the political sort of firmament in Uttar Pradesh, a multiple-time member of parliament, and now also a member of the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is in power at both in Uttar Pradesh state as well as in the center in India. So a very strong political network, both on the ground for himself, as well as in terms of a larger party structure that acts as an umbrella in this case. So I think the wrestlers are part of the reason why they're back on the streets is exactly that. They haven't been listened to, Pragya. Not a word has been said on the subject by senior members of the government, including Anurag Thakur, who is the sports minister and is otherwise known to be very sort of vocal in opinion giving, as well as in intervening in sports bodies, etc., when the need arises. I think a few months ago, there was a saga with the All India Football Federation, for example, where we ended up, India was suspended by FIFA because of government interference. This is because the government has taken proactive steps at that time in an attempt to clean up what is supposed to be corruption or other forms of mismanagement within sports federations. Right. So in this case, in fact, a letter today has gone out from the sports ministry where they have taken the exact opposite stance, and not a stance we have not seen before from these guys, which is that they have passed the buck back to the Indian Olympic Association and said that in the absence of proper management, we recommend that you set up an ad hoc committee to govern the day-to-day affairs of wrestling. Wrestling, for our international audience, is a mass sport in India. It's a very popular sport, particularly in what is known as the Hindi-speaking belt of the country in the north. So where we are, for example, in Delhi, as well as UP, Haryana, Punjab, which then goes on into Pakistan and adjoining areas, Punjab in Pakistan as well. So an extremely popular sport in India, and they've recommended an ad hoc body be set up and fresh elections be held. That also plays a part in the timing of this whole scenario as it's unfolded. The allegations are, of course, very serious allegations, some of them dating as far back to 2012. Now, Brijbhushan Sharan Singh has been involved in administration wrestling for a long, long time as well. So these allegations date back a long way. The interesting thing is, in a country where the police we've seen to be so proactive in responding to all kinds of information that comes in from the public, or all kinds of charges that are leveled by members of the public. In this case, one of the basic points that the wrestlers are saying is that a first information report has not yet been lodged in this case, naming the person who the complaint is against, and also, of course, therefore, naming the complainants, etc., etc. Now, the police doesn't require any investigation to happen or any probe to take place in order to register a first information report. It's the starting point of any procedure regarding criminal justice in India. And we've seen the police register FIRs against comedians for making jokes. So,
Absolutely.
why they are not registering a first information report, and why the individual who's in charge of the investigation, the Deputy Commissioner of Police with the Delhi Police, is seeking directions on the matter is hard to understand, because an investigation has happened. A committee was set up that has today also said that, in fact, an internal complaints committee was not in place at the Wrestling Federation, and wrestlers or other athletes did not have proper channels in which to highlight complaints such as those of sexual harassment. So, in that sense, it's an indictment at the very least of Brijbhushan Sharan Singh in terms of running the Wrestling Federation, right? So now it's a matter of whether there is enough evidence, etc., etc., and that's for the police to investigate, to figure out whether there is some substance to a criminal case in this matter or not.
We're not the first set of women in Indian sports to have this nature of complaints. Thanks for joining us, Siddhant. And that is all we have for you today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us tomorrow. You can visit our website for more People's Dispatch stories and watch our regular updates on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram.